Good morning. It's Pop again, Dennis Murray, and today is Popcast 64. It's called Nature's Wisdom, Part 14. So, yesterday and recent days, we've been talking about change, in particular, the attitude that we change first before we seek any specific changes in our arrangements in group living and at home to some degree, but certainly at work and in our places of worship and in the community. The great divide that exists now, many of us would like to see tamed, and it is a lot to achieve, but tamed so that there's considerably less hate and more appreciation for the degree to which our thriving depends on our seeing our problems as shared in common and working on them as common problems instead of seeing the problem as being the other guy with his dumb ideas about how things ought to be arranged between us. So it's an attitude change, and that's what we begin with. And so I think that the crux to that attitude change becoming any degree of accepted is, among other things, showing that it's vital to our thriving as a species that we see our problems confronting us as common problems. And then we reinforce this appreciation of how important it is to see our problems as common problems and to work together to address them by trying to put it in practice to a small degree and showing that it actually works, which would be pretty fantastic. And as well by nourishing it by symbols and rituals in our homes and businesses, places of worship and public gatherings. And part of this process of changing our attitudes and changing our arrangements towards each other by bringing our problems into the family of these are our problems and not you're the problem. Part of that is accepting things that have to be accepted. Jung said that you can't change anything till you accept it. So I mean, you have to accept that there's a divide if you want to try and soften it or tame it or end it. I mean, I quote Jung a lot. Nobody's right all the time about everything. He's said and done things in his lifetime that I don't approve of and that I don't agree with. But on the whole, he's a source of a lot of wisdom, in my opinion. And I see, quotes are offered on Facebook every day by a variety of groups, including the New York Jung Foundation, where I was a member for some years, and I attended a lot of their programs. And sometimes I think that the quotes are really useful for our purposes, and sometimes not so much. So I do pick and choose. I don't just faithfully follow the master for everything he says. Everybody's poop stinks, and you never ever want to forget that. Not about yourself, not about your heroes. Okay, back to business. I do think, however, he had a very correct point, Jung did, about accepting things before you can change them. And I think it's broader. One of the things he said was somewhat related about condemning things. Condemnation, doesn't liberate you from them. It actually builds oppression. I'm not really sure I understand all of the subtleties of that one. But I do think that when you loudly condemn things that other people are saying or doing, you're not accepting that it's human to say and do things that are mean and hateful. Um, and it doesn't mean you'll have to agree with the things that are being said, but you'll have to accept that humans often say and do things that are mean and hateful. And if you want no further part of them in your life after that, it won't be long before you'll have a very skinny set of people in your life. You will, on occasion, say and do mean and hateful things. Um, if you've been around a few years, you're not going to have a hard time thinking of some mean and hateful things you've said and done already. And you hope desperately that those people, your coworkers, your family members, your beloved, don't put you out of your life, out of their lives because you did that. Uh, it's not like anything goes. There is a standard. Remember, that's why I started the whole series where I tried to build up from the beginning. There is a standard in our psychology that it screams at us to live by. It doesn't force us to live by it, but it calls us, and it calls us with a strong emotional appeal. And what it calls us to is to be a gift to each other. So there's a standard, and when you're speaking from fear and from hate, when you're being, a real mean SOB, you're violating the standard. There's no question. But the question is, what are the rest of us to do? Are we to be so appalled by your violation of the standard that we want nothing to do with you? I don't think that's the wisdom that our psychology is giving us. I think our psychology is calling us to each other. And as people like Jung point out, that includes calling us to each other as we actually are, often given to fear, and from fear to striking out, to saying and doing very hateful things. Fear is easily turned into hate. It can make the leap in a nanosecond. And it's why mobs are so dangerous, because they're already on the edge. They've accepted fear as their gathering point, their raison d'etre. They're there because they have a fear they share, and they're stirring it up. And it isn't going to take long before it turns to hate, and then behaviors can arise that would normally not be expected or accepted. Um, at Nuremberg in Germany during Hitler's time, uh, Hitler was a natural hate monger, and Goering, the person in charge of publicity, was extremely skilled at building hate, and creating a tremendous movement, of love for the few, Heil Hitler. It's a tremendous response, but all based on the manipulation of our emotions, including uh, our easy change of fear into hate. And we saw this was among the most cultured people in Europe. I've spoken to people in the city of St. Petersburg in Russia who say they never got over the this young man's grandparents were alive at the time of the Second World War, and like most families, 25% of the population died from starvation during the siege of the city of St. Petersburg by the Russians. And the thing that even today, all these decades later, just astounds them and deeply wounds is the Germans were the most cultured people in Europe, and we in St. Petersburg considered ourselves the most European city in Russia. we idolized the Germans and German culture. And for them to turn on us in this manner to do these, hateful things to us, uh, it was doubly astounding than if it had been done by somebody who was, known to be that kind of a person. Um, and I never got over it. I mean, I spent 3 days with this young man. He was guiding Gail and I in St. Petersburg. There's a huge amount to see there if you ever get the opportunity to go. The experiences I have will stay with me forever. It was just after the wall came down and Gorbachev and Yeltsin essentially ended the Russian hatred of the United States and declared that they wanted to be friends. And I met all of these people in Russia who felt like I did. We all grew up fearing that we were going to blow each other up. As children, we used to, all of us, Russians and Americans, have constant drills where you'd get under your school desk and you'd, put your head down and cover your head with your hands so that you wouldn't be blinded by the blast. And believe me, that was that was something that's never going to leave my soul. And there's either. So I met all kinds of Russians of my age who were as ecstatic as I was that we were going to be friends. And it's probably the first time in history where two great powers were so close to destroying each other. And truly, one of them looked up and said, I've really been wrong, and I apologize, and I'd like to stop acting this way, and I'd like for us to be friends. Uh, I truly don't think there's ever been anything remotely like that in history. And, to be able to be there a year after Yeltsin stood on the tanks and to meet with my, age group who had the same experiences and were just as astounded that I was, um, it was deeply moving. It'll be with me always. So, this thing about fear and hate, emotions in general, um, they need a lot more attention than they have been given in our course on, being a human 101. Um, and we we have had, you know, advice that in hindsight appears to be bad advice in the past. I think that's always true about our psychology. It's such a huge uh, well of things, and we have no real idea of the full dimensions of its darker depths, and we constantly make offerings that seem to make sense at the time, and then further study and experience shows that we were wrong. It's kind of like the early stages when scientists were doing alchemy and trying to learn, chemistry the hard way. And eventually, scientists became extremely skilled at manipulating the universe. But it took a long time and a lot of painful experience to do it. And I think psychology's in the same situation. There's an awful lot of people that are going to say an awful lot of stupid things, including me. Um, that'll be revealed as stupid later. But about fear, I have to point out there's a very prominently, in my opinion, wrong statement that was made by President Roosevelt. He said we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And I think that that's wrong. I don't think you fear fear. I think you accept fear. It is powerful, it's dangerous, it can easily turn into hate. We can see how dangerous that is. Our great divide now includes hate on both sides towards the other. That's an incredible level. Um, so it's understandable why you might think that fear, is something to be feared. But it seems to me that it's something to be accepted. Anything about the human condition needs to be accepted if you're a human and you want to do something about our relation to each other. You have to appreciate the circumstances of our relationship fully. That's, as I was saying yesterday, it's why the founders of the American Constitution created checks and balances, because they accepted that power corrupts, that if anybody gets in power, he'll do whatever he can, or she, I don't want to be a sexist, to abuse the power. And obviously, that's not always true about everybody, but it's true enough, often enough, about so many people that it was quite wise to arrange things so that people's lust for power was likely to compete with the other guy's lust for power. And between the three branches and their desire to be heard from and to have power in the way that government decisions are made and carried forth, it was unlikely that power hunger would get too much out of control in any one branch. So, I mean, that's not saying, oh, power is evil and we hate it and we're not going to have anybody who's power hungry in our government. That's saying, well, people are power hungry and it's often a danger that they abuse power. So let's have a way where there's a competition so that your desire for power keeps him from getting too much power. And of course, part of our great divide currently is that the enormous power of publicity changes the election of presidents, and the power of the president to influence the members of his party by his 24/7 presence on all media changes how people get elected. So that there's a huge shift in the balance of power, and Congress has much less power, and the president has much more than was historically the case. And it's essentially part of the modern capacity to generate uh, fame, essentially. Um, uh, being known and being ever present in the media. This power was much harder to organize 100 or 200 years ago. Um, and we can see that the changes in the last 30 or so years have greatly accelerated this shift in power. Um, at the county level, I mean, this isn't all a one-sided, look what the other guy's doing thing for me. I'm just discussing that the situation is such that one of the things we'll want to look at is redrawing the arrangements of power, because it's gotten too far in favor of the power of the presidency because of the power of the press, the publicity power that the presidency brings with it. And um, but um, so this is the situation where emotions are part of our gifts, and they give us huge benefits in our psychology. They give us energy, they give us love, they give us hope, they give us uh, just a giant contribution to the functioning of our body and psychology. But they are also very old, and they're very, very deep in our psychology, so that we have very little ability to control them, even to manage them. But we can come to respect them, and we can come to exercise restraint to a certain degree in how much we give conscious support and conscious exercise of our emotions, um, and to the degree that we're able to exercise restraint by our conscious choices. And so that we don't just jump on the first emotional bandwagon that comes along or on every emotional bandwagon that comes along. You know, when somebody says something wonderful or draws a painting that seems, really quite special, you can't just give yourself over. Well, there's a question of whether it's wise to give yourself over to exaggerated emotional response to this thing. Um, so this is a huge subject that I don't claim to have really any particular knowledge of. I have really just been thinking about this in recent days. And I'm sure there's a lifetime of study that could be done by lots of people that might be helpful in gaining some appreciation of emotion. I'm going to do some more reading, and in coming months, I hope to talk a little more knowledgeably about emotions. But I think it's safe to say for the moment that the best we can do is respect them, of course, appreciate them, uh, and in my opinion, at this early moment in thinking about it, exercise restraint. And I think that the restraint includes an effort to keep ourselves from being manipulated into hate, allowing fear to turn into hate, um, and responding towards hate with more hate. That's enough for today. We've got a huge amount more to work on this subject matter, a lot of particular examples to discuss. And in coming days, we'll go back in history and look at political campaigns from Roosevelt forward and see how, if we can spot a difference in how people talked about each other in those days. I have the impression that people hated Roosevelt or loved him, and there wasn't any in between. Um, and so our current divide is not the newest thing under the sun. It's been with us before, and we didn't have to go back to Andrew Jackson to find it. Um, I knew a guy at the courthouse who, when I worked there back in the 60s, who was much older than I. And he was very much, an adult during the time of Roosevelt's career, and he still hated Roosevelt with a passion. And he spoke a lot of stories about Roosevelt. And so I think there's plenty of history that may give us some insight into dealing with our great divide at the moment. Okay, enough for today. A sad note, unfortunately, just as we began, ambulance took away my neighbor, delightful woman. Her husband has been very sick, and I think it may have just gotten the best of her. And, life goes on. She's 5, 6 years older than me, so she's had a pretty good run, but, one hopes for the best for her. It's just a case, fact of life. Um, I'm blessed by having some wonderful neighbors who are all a bit older than me, or in my age group, by a couple of years, one way or the other. And from time to time, the old people's taxi cab comes, which is what we call ambulance. Okay, take care. See you tomorrow. Bye bye.